For the past 10 years, Tess Owen has covered extremism, disinformation, and politics for several nationally known publications. In the October 8, 2024 issue of New York Magazine, Miss Owen wrote an article with the title Inside the Patriot Wing. She talked with several of the over 1,400 January 6 defendants who have been spending time in the District of Columbia jail about 2 miles from the U.S. Capitol. This is her story of how she got to know several men who have been convicted of, in her words, violent crimes. We asked Tess Owen, how did she get access to these folks behind bars, and what are they saying? Tess Owen, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the January 6th story. Where are you from?
I'm from the UK originally, from London. I'm a journalist based now in New York, and I have been covering the far right, disinformation, extremism, and politics in the US for about the last 7 years.
Where did you start with journalism?
I started at journalism school. I was waitressing, and then I ended up at journalism school, going to Columbia, and landed at Vice News, where I was for about 9 years, until Vice News sort of came to its unfortunate end. And I've been sort of freelancing ever since this year, and wrote for New York Magazine, and I've been a contributor for Wired magazine.
When did you first start getting interested in talking to the, I guess you'd call them defendants, or in some cases they've been already sentenced, the January 6th, 6 people in the DC jail?
I'd say it was back in late 2021. I'd started doing working on some stories for Vice News when I was there, that were coming out about some of the stories about some of the rituals, the singing the national anthem at 9 p.m., for example, which is something that has continued to this day, where the inmates in the DC unit gather together and they sing over the phone, and that's broadcast online, the national anthem, and sort of hearing about kind of this sort of community that was being formed really piqued my interest. And so after doing a kind of an initial couple of stories, I kept wondering about the issue of radicalization, and kind of what this meant as they sort of embark on their kind of carceral saga, starting in the DC jail. And I do have an interest as well in de-radicalization and radicalization in custody. And so then about a year ago is when I started writing letters to some of the January 6ers who were in prison or in DC jail, and kind of just see who might reply to me.
What's the scene that you start out with in your article in New York Magazine about the shooting or attempted shooting of Donald Trump?
Yeah, so the scene I start with is I was making dinner, and David Dempsey, who's kind of my main character, he called me, and it must have been a couple of weeks after the shooting, and he was kind of really still quite emotional about what had happened, and he wanted to tell me in detail kind of what had the scene that kind of unfolded within the jail. And I was like, one of the things that really sort of struck me was just, I mean, I knew that these guys were still kind of ride or die for Trump, but the emotion that he described, I mean, David Dempsey described kind of basically having a panic attack, that he was in his cell, and, he heard sounds coming from the rest of the jail, and he came out and saw on the television that was playing Scripps News, that the news that Trump had been shot, and he didn't really kind of see at this point that Trump was okay, but he kind of completely like lost it, in his own words, and started sort of yelling at the guards. And I spoke to another January 6er in the DC jail, and he said that they were all there was a group of them who were participating in a 1,000 burpee challenge. They were doing a sort of fitness regimen in honor of one of their former inmates who had recently gone and been sentenced, moved to a federal prison. And they heard sort of shouts coming from the TV room. And they had it on because, well, actually on that day, Scripps happened to be carrying the rally live because there was a buzz about, whether Trump would pick his VP. And so they had it on, and they were all, there was a buzz about the VP. And he initially thought, this guy, Dominic Box, that Trump had announced the VP pick. And they saw Trump had been shot. They screamed, cried, clutched onto each other, and tried to flip over tables. And then when Trump, got up and raised his fist and showed that he was alive, then it sort of turned to manic jubilation, with inmates kind of jumping up and down, punching out light fixtures. And as Dominic Box later explained to me, that, they all love Trump. The reason for this intense emotion was partly because of born out of their love for Trump, but also because without Trump, their chance for a pardon goes away. They really truly believe that Trump, if he is reelected, will pardon them.
Our audience ought to know that we're recording this before the election, and they're getting to hear it on the day of the election. So we do not know whether he was elected or not at this point.
Right.
What were you looking for?
One of the things I was looking for was to see what the experience of prison was doing to these particular inmates. Like I said, I do have an interest in radicalization and custody, and there has been there has been many examples in the past where inmates have radicalized further behind bars. We do know that the criminal justice system in the US is a punitive one, not necessarily one that is set up for rehabilitation. And particularly for those, the most extreme offenders of January 6th have been detained pre-trial in the DC jail. And they are held together while they wait for sentencing, for some a month, for some for years. And I was interested to see kind of what this, being held together, what this was doing in terms of, were they changing their minds? Was this giving them a time to reflect on what had happened? Were they distancing themselves? And what I found was quite the opposite.
You write about something called the Patriot Wing. What is that?
So it has a few names. It's the name that this unit in the DC jail that has been used to house January 6th's pretrial in the central treatment facility of the DC jail, and it has been that the January 6ers are kind of sequestered together. And the one thing is, I couldn't really get a proper answer out of the DC jail, or anyone really, about who made the decision to house them together. In court documents, there have been some discussions that the reason the reason this decision was made was because they were maybe at risk of being harmed if they were put in the general population. So anyway, this community that's been formed inside the DC jail, inside this wing, it's been kind of named by its residents, the Patriot Wing, or the Patriot Pod, or the DC Gulag is the other name that they call it.
How hard was it for you to get access eventually to the jail?
You mean to visit, or just to speak to some of the?
Well, both, but visit primarily.
Visit. It was hard. I should say that that they don't make it very easy. I'll just leave it at
that. How do you do it, or how did you do it?
Well, you have to go through a lot of you have to get a lot of permissions from a lot of different. You're supposed to get permissions from, as media anyway, from the judge, the U.S. attorney, the lawyer representing the January 6th in question, and the jail. And that's if you want to go in as a journalist with your pen and paper and everything like that. I ended up going in as a friend, essentially, or the two people, David Dempsey and Dominic Box, who I went to go visit. They put me on their visitors list, and I went in on my own.
As a friend, does that mean that you were truly friends of theirs and in sympathy with them?
No, not in sympathy with them. I was a reporter. They knew I was a reporter from the beginning, and certainly not in sympathy with them. This was a very professional interviewing. You speak to somebody for a year on the phone, which I did with Mr. Dempsey, and there were some aspects of his life that I did sympathize with, or I did find sympathetic, perhaps, which was not something that I expected. And I think that's going to be a challenge for any journalist, when you're talking to somebody and for that stretch of time. It didn't bring me to sympathize with the cause, but with Mr. Dempsey in particular, he has had a pretty bad life. And I think that, if you're a journalist and you're being told, in his case, his extended periods of homelessness, the sexual abuse he suffered as a child in group homes, I think it's hard for anyone not to sort of sympathize a little bit.
When did you, in the course of talking to him, did you find out all the personal background stuff?
I'd say about a month or so in. And, I was thinking, all right, maybe he thinks, all right, yeah, a female journalist, I can tell her a sad story about my life and, maybe get a sympathetic article out of her. And maybe I can use this to swing the judge in my favor and get a lighter sentence, just looking at it cynically. And so I had that kind of in the back of my mind. But we did talk extensively over time about his background in very specific detail. And I did bring up in person, I said to him, I had wondered at several points whether you were sort of trying to manipulate me. And I wanted to see his reaction in person to that. And he did seem very taken aback. And I believe that his story is his story on a gut level. But yeah, we started getting into his story, I'd say a couple months into beginning our conversations.
How often did you talk to him, and how did that work?
So I'd written letters, right, to a few of these January 6ers, and just kind of to see who might write back to me. And David Dempsey was somebody I knew of, not in detail. I've done a lot of reporting on political violence in the Los Angeles area, and he had been front and center to that scene for a number of years. And through my interviews with kind of local activists around there, local left-wing activists, they had told me that they felt relieved when he was arrested for January 6th. And so I didn't know what to expect. And in my letter, I had put, you can call me Collect, and I put my number. And he did call me, and he said later on, the reason he called me was because my letter was polite. I also think that with the case of David Dempsey, he's been in prison before many times, and he knew he was facing a long sentence. I don't think he didn't think he had that much to lose, and maybe just wanted to talk to somebody. So yeah, we would speak. Sometimes we would speak kind of several times a week, which would then go to kind of once a week. Sometimes we would go a few weeks without speaking. And also, I would say, okay, call me at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, and he would call me at 9 p.m. on a Sunday. It was sort of not really predictable, and we didn't really have a set time of speaking. So yeah, so over time, I got to hear about his, life in the Patriot. I really also wanted to know about what life was like in the DC jail, kind of get as much of a feel for it as I could.
Depending on who you talk to, the DC jail doesn't have a very good reputation around town. Here, what did you see about the physical DC jail, and why are they in a jail instead of a prison?
Well, they're in a jail. This particular group of inmates are in a jail because they're pre-trial. And so, the rest of them, once they're sentenced, they go off to federal prisons to serve the rest of their sentences. But in part because of the sort of complexity of the prosecution effort, some of their cases have taken a long time to resolve, and so some of them have ended up, like David Dempsey was in the unit for several years. The DC jail does have a terrible reputation, long-standing terrible reputation for awful conditions. And so, when they describe the conditions in the unit they were held in, I mean, I wasn't particularly surprised. Jails in the US have a terrible reputation. DC jail is no exception. But they also, especially in the last year or so, I'd say, enjoyed probably a lot more freedoms in the unit compared to perhaps some of the other inmates or the general population in the jail. I mean, the fact that they were able to call in to what's essentially a rally, essentially speaking to a rally every evening, where they call into a protest that is held outside the jail each night, and speak to supporters who listen to them online. They were able to kind of record a podcast from inside jail that they were able to get out. And so they do enjoy a degree of freedom that I think the general population does not enjoy. But from my understanding, it wasn't always like that.
Are they in a cell by themselves?
Initially, they were in cells by themselves. That was in part due to the COVID regulations that were kind of like across the jail, not just the DC unit. My understanding is, although I couldn't get an exact answer, was that the conditions were perhaps a bit more stringent for the DC for the so-called Patriot Wing, the January 6ers, or they were harsher for longer because they were considered a high risk population or maximum security. I can't remember the exact terminology, but over time, they were given more freedoms, as were other people in the jail too. They were not confined to their cell 23 hours a day or 20, and so they get to enjoy common areas and rec time and, basically normal jail life.
Why did they get to do, and I've watched it, the podcast, the DC Gulag, why did they get to do that?
As I understand it, it was recorded on the laptops they were given to give them access to legal discovery. As far as how they were able to get the podcast out, that I don't know. I did speak to one former resident of the wing who told me that he showed them how to do it, but he wouldn't tell me how. I did pester him for it, but he didn't want it in the story in case they wanted to get it out, continue getting it out. So
I checked numbers. I could only find August numbers. And I know you're familiar with this, but just so folks who haven't paid close attention, there have been 894 have pled guilty from this group on January the 6th. There are close to 1,500 who have been charged. That 562 have been sentenced to periods of incarceration. And it seems to be the largest ever single criminal investigation in U.S. history. Do you think, or what do you think about that? And has it been worth it from the standpoint of the Justice Department and the American people?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. And I think it's something that should be, is worthy of a serious discussion. I think it's one that's become so politicized in a way that if you even sort of venture to ask the question, is this worth it? It kind of gets shut down pretty quickly. I think that all massive prosecution efforts should be scrutinized, and are deserving of scrutiny. I think that the repercussion. I think that in part the long-term repercussions to the problem of anti-government extremism in the U.S. This is not the. I mean, I don't think that arresting hundreds of people especially for those who maybe committed misdemeanors or smaller crimes, is necessarily the ticket to addressing the issue of anti-government extremism, and in some cases may make it worse, may sharpen those divisions and sharpen those grievances against the government, which we see as being a pretty big problem and one of the major drivers on January 6th. So, and then, then there is the question of what happens when these people get out of prison. Do they leave prison angrier, more isolated than they were before? If they can't find work, if they are isolated from their communities, we already know that recidivism is a massive problem in the US in terms of people who get out of prison and then go on to recommit crimes. We know that radicalization behind bars is a massive problem. So I think it's fair to say that this is something to be concerned about with these defendants as well. And I don't really believe that the US government, or that the Justice Department has really thought that far.
What kind of, you point out several times in your article that people really weren't very helpful in giving you information. Who didn't give you information along the way when you would call them and say, you got to call the Justice Department or whatever? And who did give you information on the record?
I would say that the U.S. Marshals were probably the most helpful. Ultimately, the decision to house these pretrial defendants together, as far as I can see, it seemed like it was the DC jail, but there was a lot of passing the buck when I tried to reach out to different agencies, the DOJ. It seemed like nobody really wanted to take responsibility for who made this happen. And it didn't really seem, from what I can tell, like it was done with much consideration of the ramifications. And I do know, again, from researching or reporting on radicalization and custody, and is that there are sort of three ways to house those kinds of defendants. There is, and different countries use different methods, or can use a patchwork of methods. The first is housing them all together, where you have the risk of them radicalizing together and forming a even tighter community, and their grievances become fermented. You can disperse them throughout the criminal justice system, and that risks them radicalizing other inmates, or maybe in their case, creating conflict, or the issues of them being targets for violence. You have solitary confinement, which we know does not is an accelerator towards radicalization and recidivism. And the US currently sort of uses a patchwork of those three as they kind of move through the federal justice system. And so, in addition to for inmates who were held in the DC jail, who were maybe shunned from the community, which we can get into, they were often moved to solitary. And so there's many instances that I heard throughout doing this reporting that of January 6th being held in solitary confinement.
How often did the inmates that you were talking about think the government was trying to infiltrate them with someone?
Oh, that's just basically, that's a very common belief. There's a sort of, there was a major kind of sort of paranoia that I got, where I was described, it was described to me by quite a few current and former January 6ers who were in the wing, in this unit, who described these sort of vetting procedures they would have for new arrivals. And these vetting procedures were done to basically ensure that the new arrival wasn't secretly a federal informant, or was going to be there to listen to their conversations and rat on them, and get information that would impact their cases. And so this was a very common topic of discussion, almost like a knee jerk. I see this a lot as well on some of the message boards and chats that I monitor as part of my research for extremism. That this is almost like a knee jerk paranoia. That's if someone displays any sort of behavior they don't like, it's like either that they're a Fed or they're Antifa. It's just the sort of go to.
How much access do these DC the inhabitants of the jail have to the internet?
So they're given tablets, which are part of this, part of a broader program with the DC jail, and also jails and prisons across the country are taking them up, where it's sort of like, I guess, sort of like an iPad. I don't think it's Apple brand, but it's like sort of like an iPad, and that is loaded up with apps. And if you want to access, if you want to access content on those apps, whether it be music or movies or sermons or books, you have to pay a premium price, and you got to pay those funds that are in your commissary. So they do have access to the news and the outside world through the tablets in that sense. And this is just in the DC jail, by the way, and the DC jail, and then they have the phone calls that they can make. Now, for example, David Dempsey is in the federal prison system because since he's been sentenced, my main character David Dempsey was sentenced to 20 years behind prison, which is the second longest sentence for a January 6th, I believe. It's a different, it's a different kind of communication system. It's email, mostly email, and his the number of minutes he has per month for phone calls is capped. But they do have an email service.
Were you able to sit into any part of his trial?
I was not able to sit on on any part of his trial, unfortunately.
And so, what did he do to get 20 years? Because Enrique Tarrio is the only one. I think there are two that have gotten 22 years. Kelly Meggs and Enrique Tarrio. Why did he get 20?
So, he was described as, prosecutors called him the personification of political violence, or political violence personified. He was repeatedly described as one of the most violent rioters on January 6th, that he kind of engaged in combat against police for about an hour or hours. But really the main reason is because he had a lengthy criminal record, dating back from when he was a teenager. The sort of the story I got from him is that he, was in and out of group homes as a kid, was sexually molested, and as a teenager started getting into crime, and stealing, robberies, and he ended up doing some significant stints in prison throughout his 20s, for larceny, mainly for robbery and larceny. He did time for one act of political violence, which was using bear spray against protesters at an anti-Trump rally in Santa Monica. But because of this extensive rap sheet he had, that was why he was looking at such significant prison time.
Other names in your book, and I'll just run through them quickly, then you can tell us something about any of them if you'd like to. Dominic Box, you've already mentioned. Julian Cater, Lonnie Kaufman, Michael Curzio, Taylor Toronto, Brandon Fellows, Edward Jake Lang. Give us one of those names. Fill in as many blanks as you can on those names.
Sure. Brandon Fellows, I spoke to quite a lot for this. He's he smoked he smoked a joint in Pelosi's office in the Capitol on January 6th. He is, he's out of jail now. He was very helpful in sort of putting together the pieces of some of the earlier days inside the jail. He is somebody who's very open about the fact that he is now incredibly angry and he is very open about the fact that it was a radicalizing experience for him being behind bars. That he is now much angrier at the government than he was before, that if he could do January 6th, he would do it again. So he would make statements to me over the phone that I would say to him, should you really be saying that? And he'd say, oh, I don't care. So he was really an example, I think, of somebody who has radicalized through the experience. I think Jake Lang was not someone I spoke to in person. He, as far as I could understand, was a bit of a divisive character. in the wing in the DC jail unit. He is currently now in the Brooklyn detention center, and he is also someone who I think has expressed a lot of extreme views. He tried to form a militia from jail earlier this year. That was widely reported. Michael Curzio was one of, there was only, I think, about a fifth of the January 6ers overall had prior criminal records. And Michael Curzio, he was one of them. And he would tell me that, people with past experience kind of were given leadership roles because they sort of knew the ropes, that they could teach others kind of how to be in jail, how to be in the prison system. But also, I mean, with Curzio had a past experience of being in a white supremacist prison gang, as did another one, Brian Jackson, who was also in the January 6th wing in the DC jail. And both of these guys kind of assumed leadership roles because they knew how to operate in a gang-like structure in jail.
Clear up, got some other names, or Taylor Toronto is one I want to ask you about in a second, but clear up a number of people who are supporters of Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself have said out loud that no guns were in the Capitol, no guns were involved in this process. And when you wrote about Taylor Toronto, you say he had a van full of guns and ammo nearby somewhere. What do you know about the guns?
That was Lonnie Kaufman had the. I think it was Lonnie Kaufman who had the guns and ammo, because Taylor Toronto was arrested for. So yeah, Lonnie Kaufman had the truck full of guns and ammo and Molotov cocktails. So that his case was highlighted, or was quite high profile. His arrest. I didn't speak to him at all. As far as I know, he was someone who lived off the grid before, and pretty much lives off the grid now since he got out of jail. But there were instances where there were firearms on the ground, and there were various improvised weapons.
So, as you were putting this together, what came through to you in the process of research that was the most important to you? And you kept trying to figure out what the story was. What hit you the hardest?
Let me think about that. I think that what hit me the hardest was, and again, this is not to be sympathetic to what happened on January 6th or to what happened to David Dempsey, but Dempsey's story to me was really a story of broken systems. Someone who has been completely failed by the systems. He was in group homes. He was molested in a group home. He was in and out of prison. His experience in the prison, each experience put him further into a hole and pushed him further into criminality. He was homeless for most of his adult life. And when Trump came along, Trump made him believe that he could be a better person for whatever reason, that Trump sold him an opportunity. And he was maybe just getting his life back on track, actually, before January 6th or around January 6th. He was a father. When he was arrested, he'd actually found somewhere to live for the first time in his life. And it feels like he kind of threw that all away for Donald Trump. And so it was a sadder story, really, than I thought, than I expected. And then I guess the failure of the prison system to rehabilitate or de-radicalize people.
You say in your piece that he was 37 years old, and you go on to say he slept in the McDonald's play areas. He was on hot air vents that he would sleep on, and and the rest of the stuff, including going through child protective services. His father had been in prison. Anybody else in this group that you write about have the similar background?
Not really, no. I mean, he was a bit of an outlier in the sense that he had a particularly tragic story, I think. A lot of them, Dominic Box, by comparison, he went to the University of Arkansas. He is from a relatively well-to-do family, from what I could understand. He had a job as a car salesman. He's close with his mother. He got into this sort of QAnon adjacent world, kind of a conspiracy fueled world about against child trafficking. That sort of led him into the election conspiracies. But he was definitely had a very different story than David Dempsey did.
Come back to this in a moment, but first of all, why did you come to the States, and what year did you come to the States in the first place?
I came to the States in 2012, right after Hurricane Sandy. And I came to the States really because my dad's American and I had a passport, and I thought, you know what, might as well enjoy it, seeing as so many people want one.
Where is your dad from?
He's from Indiana originally.
And did you live with him when you came here, or were you in school at the time?
No, I was living with I'd been to undergrad, or done part of my undergrad at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and I had some friends who were living in New York, and I'd visited them quite a lot when I was at Mount Holyoke. And so when I came up, I was waitressing at a place in Fort Greene, Brooklyn called Number 7, and just trying to figure out what to do with my life, really. Both my parents are journalists, so I'd avoided it for a long time. I was sort of thought I'd do anything else, perhaps, and then I ended up applying to Columbia, and I got in, and I've been reporting ever since.
What kind of journalism do your parents do?
My mum, they're both mostly retired. My mum makes documentaries now, but she was a foreign correspondent covering conflict, mainly in the Middle East, but not exclusively. And my dad, he was at CBC for a long time, kind of running things basically, or kind of more of a senior producer position, and then he moved more into sort of journalism advocacy, freedom of speech stuff.
Why do journalists, and this would apply to you too, why do journalists feel that they need to be advocates? What triggers that?
I think that maybe the desire to tell human stories, and desire to talk to people and to shine light on places that wouldn't normally get light. I mean, I think also, telling stories that people want to read. Certainly the Patriot Wing story, I also wanted to tell a story that was like people wanted to read. That was it, that gave people a glimpse into a world that they wouldn't normally, and that was maybe had elements of humor in it, that had lots of human elements in it, basically. And I do think that as you end up talking to people, you end up hearing the good and the bad and the tragic. And that, I don't know if that's a very good answer, but
there's a New York Times story about your wedding. It was important enough that they wrote it up. Why did they write it up, and who did you marry?
They wrote it up. It's in the mini vows, not in the mega. The mega vows is like for children of oil barons, but this is the mini vows. I had tweeted shortly, I think about a month before our wedding, or a few weeks, on the anniversary of Unite the Right in Charlottesville, that, for what a horrible day that was, it's also the anniversary of when I met my husband, who's also a journalist. And I met Andy Campbell, who is a writer, author of the book We Are Proud Boys, and he is a reporter and editor at HuffPost. And we met in Charlottesville a day after the Unite the Right rally in 2017. And so I tweeted about this, about how we were getting married in a few weeks. And the person who writes the mini vows, or one of the people who writes the mini vows for the New York Times, saw my tweet, and she got in touch and wanted to write about it. So there we go.
So go back to Charlottesville. Who were you working for then, and why were you in Charlottesville?
I was working for Vice News, and my editor sent me out there the day after the rally to cover the aftermath. So I wasn't there for the rally itself. My husband was there for the rally itself. I was not. We did have a video team also on the ground who were there for the rally itself, and they did a very widely watched and widely accoladed documentary on the events of Charlottesville. I was there to sort of talk to people and cover the aftermath, basically.
What did you take away from that?
What I learned really was that Charlottesville was it's a great town, and that there's a reason that it was targeted by these hateful groups. It's a kind of seen as a progressive bastion in Red Virginia, and it's a very diverse city, not without its problems, but people felt like they had been targeted specifically, and that their reputation are now kind of associated with hate, when really that's not what they stand to represent.
Go back to the Patriots group. How did they raise their money?
They raise their money through, so they have a lot of them have these fundraisers on Give, Send, Go, which is a Christian fundraising platform, like GoFundMe. And so many of them have personal fundraisers, and then there is this vast network of outfits that raise money for them on their behalf. So there's so many, I'd have to pull up the exact names, but there's all these different outfits. Some of them run by former January 6th prisoners or defendants, or their family members, and they all kind of claim to, some of them claim to fund their appeal process. Some of them claim to fund their legal representation. Some claim to offer reentry services. Some fund their commissaries. There's one where they link defendants up with sort of sponsors around the country. I think that in the case of David Dempsey, he said that there was a nice lady in Michigan who would put money in his commissary. So there's a kind of vast network of sympathizers who basically bankroll them.
What's the routine every day at 9:00?
Every day at 9:00, someone from the jail will call into this small protest that takes place, or a rally that takes place, a vigil, right outside the jail at a so-called Freedom Corner, which is led by Mickey Whithoff, who's the mother of Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was shot, or the rioter who was shot inside the Capitol by Capitol Police. And she has been turned into a sort of martyr for this movement. And for the past 3 years, they have held this rally right outside the jail every evening. And at 9:00, which is a staple of this rally, that someone from the January 6th, from the wing, will call in, and they all gather around the phone, and they sing the national anthem over the phone. And this is broadcast online to thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And in addition to singing the national anthem, they flicker the lights inside the wing on and off.
What kind of social media do they put that in? And is it live streamed?
It is live streamed, yeah. So there's a bunch of some of the activists who are there every night. They stream on their personal platforms, mostly Rumble, which is a kind of fringe version of YouTube. It's streamed on Telegram. I'd say those are probably the two main ones.
When most people listen to this, they may or may not know whether Donald Trump or his opponent, Kamala Harris, won the election. If you're a prisoner right now, what are you thinking about this election?
Well, from what I heard from them, this is really make or break for them. They believe that Trump will make good on his promises to give them pardons, get them out, and that Donald Trump winning the election is a ticket to their freedom. And for some of them who are serving very long sentences, I mean, that's not nothing.
How much does religion play in the way they feel about the future?
I think that, for my main characters, we're certainly not, I would say, religious men. There certainly are people who hold perhaps more Christian or Christian nationalist views, and certainly a lot of the support that they have gotten via letters, for example, are from people who are very religious. They've gotten a lot of, saying that, that they are on a sort of God ordained mission, that they are soldiers, that they are serving for what was a noble cause.
When did you start writing this, and how long did it take you to write it?
Let me see. I started writing it, must have been in about May. It was a pretty quick turn. We wanted to get it out before the election. So it was fairly quick for how long it was. Yeah.
How many words?
But I think it was about 7,000 in the end.
And when did you finish it?
When did I finish it? I finished it about I gave in a draft. I submitted a draft in let's say early September, and then and we were still doing final touches on it. I think that a few days before it went into print.
If somebody wants to read the article, how do they get it?
You can go to nymag.com and go to the Patriot Wing inside the jail block run by Jan 6 rioters.
And have you gotten any feedback from David Dempsey or any of the people you talked to?
Not yet, no.
Any feedback online?
Feedback online, yes. I mean, mostly positive feedback. And the one thing I was pleased is that I wanted this to be I wanted there to be nuance to the story, because I feel like this is the story of January 6th. I mean, there's not much room for nuance in the world that we live in today. And what I hope people would take away, which many people did, is that this is also a comment on the criminal justice system, and it's the fact that it is not really set up to rehabilitate people. And I'm glad that a lot of people took away that this is kind of issue with the punitive based criminal justice system, that the system creates its own problems.
Did you try to talk to the U.S. Justice Department or somebody in the U.S. Attorney's Office about this whole issue you're just talking about now?
I did, yes, to not much avail.
Do you have any idea why they wouldn't talk to you?
I mean, the ongoing nature of the prosecutions. I'd certainly spoken to former Justice Department officials, and I've seen comments. People. I was curious, first of all, about digging into the idea of overreach. Whether there was even an element of truth to the idea of judicial overreach, which I learned is a very subjective issue. Because the laws are there, the laws are being enforced, but are the laws always enforced when it comes to, for example, prosecuting misdemeanors, particularly federal misdemeanors? No, federal misdemeanors are not typically prosecuted, but in this case there are. But still, the laws exist. So the idea of it's a very squishy term, which I think is what's made it such a easy one for the pro January 6 activists to kind of co-opt and use to their advantage to whitewash what happened on January 6th.
A couple of things before we close it down. What about the song that they wrote? And you say in your article, with Donald Trump?
Yes, that's right. What was its name? It's become kind of a mainstay of Donald Trump's rallies now. I think he played it just recently, the other day. They like to say that it ranked in the charts above Taylor Swift. I think it did actually nudge Taylor Swift off the Billboard charts for a couple days, but it sank quite quickly after that.
Did you find out how they did it together?
It was taken. I mean, it was a recording. It basically interspersed a recording, with Trump's voice. It wasn't that they sat in a recording studio together, or anything like that.
But did they coordinate it directly with him?
I actually, I didn't go into it's a good question. I didn't go into the exact production or how it came together, and I wish I knew that.
So one of the things that often happens in a magazine is the editing at the end and the fact checking. At New York Magazine, did you have people that fact checked what you wrote?
Absolutely. They have a very, very rigorous and impressive fact checking team. And I was very impressed by it. And gave me a chance to sort of go through my notes, and they wanted to reach out to people I've spoken to. Obviously, there were some difficulties because for some of my main characters who are currently still incarcerated, that was a bit of an issue, but they did a fantastic job.
Were they able to get some of the people that you quote to make sure the quotes were accurate?
Yes, they did. They were able to speak to some of them.
So what's next for Tess Owen?
Well, I'm currently at Wired as a kind of a freelance contributor, so covering disinformation in the election and its aftermath for the next few months. And looking into, I really enjoyed working on a story of the sort of size of the Patriot Wing story, and so I'll definitely, I've got my thinking cap on for what could be my next big magazine piece.
Besides getting your article, what would you recommend to people that want to dig down deeper on this? Where can they go to see things that might help them better understand what's going on?
In terms of the January 6th universe, or the
I mean, for instance, I got on because of your piece. I got on and watched the DC Gulag. The three men sitting at a table with the Donald Trump photograph and talking about what it's like to be there. Are there other things that you can look at?
Yeah, I mean, there's a Telegram channel called The Prisoner's Record, which kind of is an interesting glimpse, I think, into the activist side, the support network that props up these individuals, and that's also where they broadcast the nightly vigils. You can also look at some of you can see the live streams of the nightly vigils online, and those are also interesting to listen to because they'll have people who call in from not just the DC jail but also federal prisons, and so it's a very kind of interesting glimpse into that world and the way that they're thinking, and yeah, so that if you
did you run into other journalists who were trying to do the same thing you were doing?
Not this particular angle, no. I mean, there was some stories. So I spent some time at the at Freedom Corner, and initially I had really been keen on the idea of this group of activists led by Ashley Babbitt's mother, Mickey Whithoff. They rent a house together in kind of near Capitol Hill. That's sort of not like a flop house, but basically it's a way station for families of January 6ers to stay there. They house people who've just gotten out. It's really a hub, an activist hub, just like for January 6ers. And I was sort of desperate to go to that house. I really wanted to, I wanted to see what it looked like. Do they have? I was imagining, whiteboards with all sorts of plans on them because they spend a lot of time every day in the courthouse as well. They go and sit in on all the cases, and I just thought it'd be a fascinating glimpse. But anyway, there was a very good story in the New Yorker that came out, basically exactly about that. She did get access to the house, and so that angle was very much explored. And then there's also a book by Ryan Riley, who's at NBC. He has a very good book on the activists who have kind of done the FBI's work for them, essentially identifying and unmasking January 6ers or help them with the prosecution process, called Sedition Sleuths. So, people have kind of picked out their angles here and there, but haven't found anyone who kind of did the story of talking to January 6ers from jail. No.
Did you think along the way maybe a book could come out of all this?
Yes, actually, that was my initial hope. That was kind of what I reached out to them for, was a potential book. And I still think that there is a possible book in there. I think really, though, it hinges on what happens, what happens, who wins the election, essentially, which I know that this comes out afterwards, so we'll know by then. But, we're looking at two very, very different paths. If Trump follows through with his promise to pardon, we're looking at two very, very different paths for this group of defendants. And so I kind of will see where the story goes from there.
Well, the interesting thing is the first people to listen to this will listen to it at as early as 7 o'clock in the morning on election day. So we're right in the middle of all this.
Wow.
And,
yeah.
Tess Owen, thank you very much. New York Magazine, October the 8th, 2024 is the article. I assume you can find it by going through Google. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking to you. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.